Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Tamira Cousett. Tamira is a mother, ancestral medium, ritual facilitator, and student of ancestral and earth-honoring wisdoms. She is the beloved grandchild of folks descended from West Africa and the Irish and British Isles by way of Alabama, Ohio, and Indiana. She enjoys co-weaving reverence-filled ritual containers and supporting intergenerational ancestral connections across space and time for individuals and groups. Her ancestral connection and healing practices center Black liberation theologies and wisdom rooted in African diaspora spiritual traditions. In her professional career as an environmental research chemist, she has supported environmental justice and community impact-related studies for over a decade. Tamira now lives with her family on the ancestral lands of the Catawba and Eno peoples. Tamira, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me here.
Tamira, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to do an opening or offering for the guests to hear the beautiful rites that you just did before we started recording so folks can hear.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And the folks that are listening are welcome to take a moment to center themselves in their space as I call in those layers of support that we all have access to and that all support and love us here. Egungun, kiki egungun. Eguni ku ran ran feawo, ku opoi poi. Boda soba fon lewo, iguni ku, batabango, egunde. Diaba fatori nala egunde, ashe, asheo. Welcome to all the bright, wise, and loving ancestors of myself and Ryan and all the folks that have gathered to listen to our conversation. We welcome the wisdom of these elevated ones. We welcome their presence and we ask that they be with us in this time. We are thankful for the gift of their companionship and kinship, and we extend gratitude and love to all the sacrifices and the rituals and the prayers and the love that have been poured into us being here. May this time together be deeply nourishing for us individually and collectively, and may it inspire connection with ancestors and all of those who are listening. We thank you so deeply for your love. Ashe.
Ashe. Thank you, Tamira.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was so beautiful. I felt folks listening needed to experience that. So thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
So Tamira, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you first got into the work you're doing today?
Yeah, so background is a long, winding one, but I'm trying to just feel into what wants to come through. So, I am a twin. I am a daughter. I am a mother. And the place that I find myself in right now is in a deep, endless ocean of exploring liberation and what that means, and how to be supported in practices of liberation through ancestral connection. And I'm anchoring that where I am. I'm anchoring it in my family. I'm holding that in myself and in community that I'm in. And that's sort of where I'm coming from and what I'm holding. And I'm here, I say always, because of grace, really and truly because of the grace and love of my people that's brought me here. I came to this path about 5 or 6 years ago, through working with plant medicine, sacred plant medicine, and being in ceremony and having my people show up and be like, holding up the mirror of accountability and being like, where you been? What you doing? What are you going to do going forward? And so having those connections with them opened this pathway of remembering, wanting to remember what it is that I came here to do, resting into the layers of accountability that I have with them and remembering that I'm accountable to them, even though we live in a society that doesn't physically carve out space, and there's not framework or structure or like representation built into our systems that we're moving in. And so it's been that remembering and stepping onto that path. And the plant cesters, as some people call them, have brought me to this path, and a myriad of different ones continue to support me on the unwinding of the path that I'm moving along. But I'm here because of grace, from the grace of my people, the ones that are living and the ones that are no longer in bodies.
Thank you. It's interesting. You mentioned 6 years ago. My daughter is 6. And I think that was sort of when I had a shift in my own consciousness towards, I guess it was somewhat ancestral, but also just what does it mean to be white in this time, and like addressing systemic racism. And, I'm curious do you think that was that time, and like between like 2014, 2016, I don't know, it just seems like there was a lot of energy around there. Like, it was like Donald Trump was getting elected. There was like Me Too was starting. There was like Dakota Access Pipeline. There was Eric Garner, like, Freddie Gray. Trayvon had already been killed earlier. So it just seemed like there was a collective shift around that. But I don't know. Do you sense that too?
Absolutely. But I also feel like the time is always ripe and right now to get in connection and to be curious about liberation and how our ancestral connections can support that. But I'm not the only person for sure. I know I have people that I'm in community with who also were initiated onto these pathways of connection around the same time that I was being brought to them. So absolutely. Absolutely.
And so how do you, for folks who maybe don't know what ancestral medium is or how you relate to earth honoring traditions, could you just give folks a little bit of like, what does it mean to be an ancestral medium, and maybe describe a little bit of the work that you do with individuals and groups?
Yeah. So first we can touch on what is a medium, and a medium is a bridge. And the truth is that we're all mediums. We all have a capacity while we're in these bodies to be in connection and communion and in communication with other realms of reality, other planes of reality, and other beings that don't just have bodies like we do. And so I use the term medium. There's nothing fancy about it. There's nothing fancy or special about what I do. We all have the capacity to do these practices of connection and to be in relationship with our people and receive their wisdom and transmit that wisdom into the world. Our bodies are hardwired for it. It's in the blueprint of how we are set up. But once again, dominant culture has ideas about what's valuable in terms of language, education, all the, there are these other cultural ideas about what forms of wisdom have value and which ones don't. And so the work that I do is centered on recovering those aspects of wisdom that live in all of us and that are extremely valuable and that carry the wisdom of our people and carry the capacity for connection and for healing and for us being in liberated relationships with one another and also with our ancestors so that we can build a liberated future where there's space for all of us. So that is a bit about what I do and the languaging around a medium. And particularly my work is really centered around Black liberation theologies. Like the work that I'm sharing with the world is not new. It didn't come out 3 years ago. It didn't come out 6 years ago. It's work that Black folks have been doing since and before we arrived here to stay connected to our ancestors, to Creator, to the elements, to the earth, and to honor and pay reverence and respect. Also indigenous cultures, the indigenous folks that were here before us, very similar modalities and routes of practice of being connected with their people, ancestors, spirit, and the earth. And that's basically what I'm supporting people in remembering and stepping back into those capacities for connection that already live inside of us. And so a lot of the work is like, can we be in our bodies? What does it feel like to be embodied right now? Oh, you have grief? Well, there's some work we need to do around grief. Oh, you have anger? There's work that needs to happen around anger. What's present in the landscape? And then how do we presence what is there? How do we work with what is there? And then how do we connect with our people and ask, what medicine do they have for us? What are the rituals that need to be happening right now to support us with our grief, to support us with our anger? And so those are aspects and parts of the work, is really reigniting the wisdom that is already carried in the body and trusting the body again to support us in connection with our people and bringing those rituals forward and continuing to build and heal from there. So that's the work that I do. I've been saying here recently, I'm like, yeah, it's not sexy. It's not like, woo, it just is like in being, that's part of the work, is our capacity to be and be in our bodies and be with what's present, because that's where connection is. It's not in the past. It's not in the future. It's like, what does our capacity look like to be present right now and to be centered in that, and then to connect through a space of presence, because our ancestors are here in the present moment, like right here, right now, not out there in the world, not in what we're buying or what we're told to consume, but like right here. And then sitting with the discomfort of, oh shit, everything that I need is right here. But I've been ritualized into, or initiated into, rituals and systems that tell me that I need to go get it out there. Like I need to go buy it. I need to go get my belonging over there in that group and in that thing. And so that's part of the work that I do, is like coming back home to the body, coming back home and working through presence from that space, and working with the connections that are already there that most of the time people dust off or brush off and don't pay attention to, because dominant culture is like, that's not valuable. What? You had a dream? You dreamt about an ancestor, or what? Like, you're having synchronicity, these moments of synchronicity, or you're communing with nature and your people are coming to you through the water, through the birds, so just affirming and amplifying our capacity for connections, and the fact that they already exist. We wouldn't be here if they didn't. So we get to show up with agency and autonomy and sovereignty, and we can come into the body and choose how we want to be in relationship going forward.
I love that so much. I've heard you speak on some other podcasts about just like your relationships with some of your own ancestors. Can you maybe talk about like some stories for how it works for you and sort of your healing journey?
Yeah, so my healing journey is ongoing. I'll be working on that probably the rest of my life. And yeah, there are lots of experiences I had when I was younger that I didn't have a framework or a context for, because I'm the daughter of a Black woman who was living in the deep South with, 2 kids, a single parent. And most of my childhood was rooted on survival. So there wasn't a space for, oh, I'm having dreams, and oh, like these inner knowings, and like I'm writing things and someone's here with me. Oh, and when grandpa died, I saw him after he died and I talked to him in my dreams. So, there wasn't a framework or a context for that, because we were so heavily in survival mode. And I think my mother also, was impacted by the Great Migration. Like, my grandparents came from the South. They came from Alabama, came up north, and just the change in scenery in that way, and the loss of connection with an agricultural sort of way of being, not working on the land, but like living in tenement apartments and, all these other things. And then moving into a really strict religion through the fruit of Islam. And I mean, somebody telling you what your spirituality is, somebody telling you what your practices are, somebody not centering always your divinity, but centering your defects in some sense, in that cultural experience through that lens of that organized religion. And there are beautiful aspects to the religion where people were supported, but there are also aspects where people got left out, like homosexuality and queerness was not welcome in those spaces, right? Folks who had those life experiences and identities were held as having deficit or evil or jinn, like demons. And so my mother didn't grow up with a framework where there is space for spiritual experiences and space for these different intersectional ways of being in the world. But it was really about assimilation and survival for her. So I didn't grow up with that, but it didn't mean that it stopped the interactions and engagements that were happening to me as a child. And I just remember I would lay in bed at night and be like, oh, I'm not alone. Like they're here. Like somebody's here. Like they love me. And just having this sense of surety and belonging. And so it happened through dreams. It happened through I would just start writing things. What I know now is automatic writing, but those have been ways that they had been looking out for me and supporting me, moving up into the point where I had that direct contact after being in ceremony. And I'm like, oh shit. Whoa. I knew somebody was here, but y'all are here. Okay. So yeah, moving from that experience up into where I am now. And a lot hasn't shifted as far as how they show up. I think I'm refining how I'm in relationship and how those connections are. The more that I show up for connection and I'm available, there's an invitation to refine just the channels of connection, which feel really good and really beautiful, because there were definitely spaces in my own self that needed refining. I didn't have a lot of boundary work. So be like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be porous. Come and be in my body. Let me feel the pain or let me feel, so it was an opportunity, and it's been an opportunity to refine how we're in contact and how we're in connection. And I'm grateful for it. And it's evolving and it's changing. I'm evolving and I'm changing throughout this process. And so those are just some of the ways they show up, often in the form of downloads now for me. Sometimes I get up and I'm like, oh, I need to go to the altar. Something, I don't know what's happening, but I need to go get a candle. I need to make an offering. I need to sit because somebody has something to say. There's something somebody wants to tell me. So I get a lot of those moments often, and it's been a process of just trusting them and carving out space and time to center the value and the importance of the 3 to 5 minutes that they're usually asking of me, to sit with the wisdom that they're sharing with me. And so that happens often, and it's just a practice of listening and being present.
And I think could you give someone a story of a particular ancestor? I've heard you mention your great-great-great-grandmother.
Yes.
Yeah, can you tell a little bit about her for folks?
Yeah, yes. Lila Farrow. So my people came from Alabama, and this is just a really beautiful way. I do these foot washes, and I prepare them with flowers from the garden, from the market, with herbs. And I knew a little bit about her. Not a whole lot. I know she lived to be 104. I know at some point she became blind. I know at some point she was enslaved, but I didn't have a whole lot of, context other than that. And so I really got called into creating these washes with flowers and herbs, and had no idea there was an ancestral connection until I went to go visit my grandmother, so a couple years ago or so. And then she just started talking stories, and I'm sitting here recording because I'm I want to know more about our people. Who are we? Where do we come from? What did they do? Do you remember songs your grandmother used to sing? Do you remember songs your great-great-great-grand, what do you remember? What can you tell me? And I started recording these things, and she said, mama's mama, because she was raised by her grandmother. And while her grandmother was raising her, she was taking care of her mother, who was 104 years old. So she said, mama's mama she belonged to that old foot washing church. And I was like, what? Wait a minute. There's a church and they wash feet at this church? Tell me more. Whoa, is this an ancestral connection practice that is happening here? And it didn't even occur to me to ask my people that I'm in connection with, what is the context behind this thing that I'm being that is just here. And I have a desire to be in relationship with and practice. And so she started talking about it. And I was just like, oh my, she's like, yeah, they was outside in the woods and they would gather and they would look for herbs and look for stuff that was grown in the woods and wash each other's feet with these foot washes and pray and sing. And I'm like, oh, this is ancestral right here. Like, why has no one told me this? And so I think that's one of the sweet ways that they show up and affirm, connection. And that was one of those happenings that just unfolded with a lot of sweetness. And I look back at it and I laugh because it's just so funny. I'm like, there's not one moment it feels like that they don't have their hands in like something, like just support wise. And then looking back, it's like, oh, yeah. Okay, you were there. You were there. You were there. So yeah, it's a space of joy and delight to just reflect on and have this constant revealing of how they're showing up and how the things and the practices that I feel called to and that I engage with and the rituals are like, it's not a personal thing. It's like, oh, there's lineage behind this. There's the ashe of lineage and repetition through lineage that binds me to some of these practices that feel new to me, but are in fact lineage-based practices.
Thank you for sharing that. It's beautiful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
There's a question I wanted to ask you about that's something I've been grappling with in my own life is I have traditionally been a Buddhist, sort of mindfulness meditation. And, in that tradition, there's sort of, for folks who are listening, there's the four noble truths of like, one, suffering exists. Two, the cause of suffering is craving and aversion and sort of like grasping. Then like suffering can be stopped. So there is an answer. And then the answer is like the path, the Buddhist path. And in that path, it's really interesting because one of the teachers that I've listened to has said, if someone doesn't understand craving and aversion and like how we get into cycles of wanting what we can't have and then like not wanting certain experiences and like how that causes us suffering, then they won't be able to like become liberated. And he said, and like this is maybe just, I don't think these are intention, but one thing he said is like, if you were to go to a statue of say the Buddha and like prostrate 108 times and offer it food and, like do a prayer for the Buddha, but you don't understand like how your own actions, like if you're mad at people or like yelling at your kids and you don't understand the craving and aversion piece, then just like offering the Buddha some like food or like doing 108 prostrations is not going to like solve your suffering. And so I've been with like, there's part of me that is like wary of it's like, how does the ancestral piece of like rituals and in the current moment, I've been like internally had some tension about like, how does it work with like the craving and suffering knowledge of like what I've learned for Buddhism and what seems to be very true also is like honoring ancestors and like, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts of like how those two, I'm kind of like dropping a big internal thing I'm grappling with on you, but I just don't know how to reconcile those two things. And I'd be curious if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my spiritual lineage is not Buddhism, but what feels true is just when people talk about ancestral healing, like, okay, you go to the Buddha to prostrate, but like, how are you living? What are you living into? And that's ritual, right? And it's the same thing that is true for one's lineage. People talk about ancestral healing all the time. Oh, you want to get your people well, but you're not willing to divest from the systems of legacy that they help build, right? So like, what are we doing here? Sometimes there's this really topical way of approaching ancestral healing and connection where we ourselves are not ready to do the healing work that is going to be necessary on our parts as descendants that are living in these systems of legacy that need to be dismantled. And I think it's the same could be true for like, oh yeah, I'm going to go make these offerings. I'm going to show up, but first I'm going to like key somebody's car for cutting me off, like in the parking lot, whatever it is. So I think the two are very similar when we approach ancestral healing practices and ancestral connection practices is to be like really mindful, like, what are you really here for? Do you want to heal? Do you have a capacity to actually be in connection? Because when we come into relationship and connection, there's accountability. So if you're going up to that statue of the Buddha, like, are you communing with the spirit of this one and being like, oh, accountability. Okay, yeah, I just did key this person's car. Like, and I'm sitting at your feet, and I've read and learned these principles, but I have yet to embody them. It's the same thing when we talk about ancestral connection and healing practices. What are the rituals that we're embodying? Are they tied to legacies of oppression? Because if we're embodying these rituals, we're affirming and reifying the systems that we're in. Are we ready to divest from them? Are we ready to sit with the grief of how deeply woven into our lives these rituals of disconnection and oppression are? And to sit with the anger of that. And then to have the capacity and the resiliency to want to build something different and to show up differently. And so I think the two are similar, different contexts, but I feel like it's really similar across the vein of ancestral connection and healing, and also this Buddhist practice. It's like, okay, are you gonna look at what the impact of lineage is and what it has on you, and how you participating in currents or threads that don't center liberation? Because in some ways or shape, we are. Even if we want to be free, we can't swim in the ocean and not get wet. So it's like, can you locate yourself in these systems? Can you locate, yes, where you're oppressed, but also where you might be oppressing others, where you might have privilege, and are you ready to divest and dream into something different?
Thank you. That really resonates with me too. I love how you said, like, embodying. It's not just the top level, I did the 108 prostrations, but how are you embodying the practice in your life? I think, and like you said, it's maybe even more accountable with if you're coming to your ancestors and you're like, here's 108, and then they're like, wait a minute, what? Like, that's all you're going to do? You're not going to do the real work?
Yeah. What is the real work? How are you building relationship? Who are you in relationship with? You like, oh, I paid reparations. Wait, what? Are you in relationship to the people you're paying reparations to? Have you asked them what their idea of reparations are? Is there a process of like repair that's happening? Or are you using this currency, this system of currency that is a legacy system? When we talk about chattel slavery and oppression, are you using this system of currency to buy your way out of accountability and guilt and shame?
How are you, or the ancestors that you're in relationship with? I'm cautious to say, these times, as in like, these times are so hard right now, when for many white folks, it's just like the first realization that things are hard. Whereas for Black and brown folks, it's like, these times aren't any harder than what we've been through
for a long time.
Yeah, for hundreds of years, generations. So maybe I'm sort of answering the question of like, maybe the ancestors aren't saying anything different now than they've said before. I'm just kind of curious with like climate and, racial justice and COVID, if there's anything coming through that has been helpful for you or grounding in the face of these times, even though they're not necessarily different than before.
Yeah, I think for myself, what I've been sitting with is uncertainty. And they were like, we didn't know what was going to happen day to day. And y'all got cell phones and the internet. So like, can you sit in the discomfort of the uncertainty? And do you have capacity as you're sitting in this discomfort to take action and to mobilize and to dream and to imagine something different for yourself? And that's really and truly what I have myself been sitting with, is just being in the discomfort of uncertainty, and then asking myself these questions of how I'm woven into these systems, how I found belonging in these systems, and how do I want to divest from them, and what do I want to create going forward? And it's like, all while the world is on fire. So, but when has it not been? When has it not been is the question. So Yeah, just having the grace to sit with the uncertainty and call in support and know that part of the accountability process is to mobilize and to embody and to be in action with what wants to come forward, the healing and also the practices of centering liberation.
I keep wanting to thank you for everything because it's very touching and meaningful for me. So,
Yeah.
Ashe.
Yes.
Another question is something I've been sitting with. It's turning a little bit of a one-on-one session, but is uncertainty for me. I've realized another layer is also like disorientation, like spiritual and sort of like physical disorientation. I'm someone who doesn't have a great sense of direction, so I'm sort of trying to like relearn to be oriented to the physical world, but also like sort of ancestral spiritual like soul level disorientation of just like, where am I in space in relation to people? And I'm curious if that's come up for you or how that relates to the ancestral practice at all.
Absolutely. When COVID began to unravel, I had a lot of physical and just spiritual disorientation just because of the way that the ground was moving under my feet. And then George Floyd and then Breonna Taylor. So it just was, I was like, what the fuck am I doing here? Like, did I really say I wanted to be here and be in this? Like, what is happening? And so through the supportive community and people that I hold dear to my heart, I had to take time out to grieve and to also level up my practices of like, what am I anchoring toward? Am I anchoring myself in the direction of liberation? What are my practices like energetically for like grounding and rooting in that and connecting with that? And so I definitely had this thing, and I think it happens often where we're asked to level up what our practices of connection are, and we're asked to reevaluate, wait a minute, do your actions match with your values? And are you centering liberation or these, whatever it is that you're centering, how are you centering it? How are you embodying the values that you're holding and what you're dreaming into for the future? And so I definitely had that. And I think it comes with the terrain of the ancestral work. There's a lot of white folks that are waking up from whiteness. Like, and the question is like, yeah, it's going to be really spiritually disorienting. It's going to be real spiritually disorienting because there has been systems that have been built on people being spiritually and physically disconnected from their bodies, disconnected from their people, disconnected from the earth in order to hold down the rituals that affirm what oppression is in the context of what we're living through in the West. And so, yeah, as you're waking up from that, sure, you're going to be like, I don't know which way is up. I don't know which way is down. And I think that is part and parcel of the product, of the process of self-recovery. This is something that Bell Hooks talks about in her book, Sisters of the Yam, which is basically a book dedicated to Black women in self-recovery. And I encourage all people to read it because there are aspects across race and gender where you will find some part of yourself that you need to recover in this book. And you can ask the question, like, how is this applicable to me culturally and what my experience is in my body? But I think it's a process of recovering yourself, aspects of who you are, and even your ancestry from this flattening that we know as whiteness, from this binary system that we know as whiteness that has collapsed entire lineages of distinct culture and language and practices of honoring the earth and affirming life into this very flat, dull thing that is rooted on others being oppressed and suffering so that it can be fed.
Yeah, thanks. The thing that stands out is it's kind of like what Resma has talked about, Resma Minicum, for folks who don't know. A lot of white folks don't understand that we terrorized and killed each other and uprooted each other in Europe and other places before coming to the US and repeating that. And so I think part of my disorientation, I'm guessing, is like reconnecting with where am I from, like on a deep level, like indigenous Europe or Scotland or, like some of these places where there is custom and language and rooting, because we've all been uprooted and then have perpetuated that on others.
Absolutely. We all have been uprooted and then rooted into the system that wants us to terrorize and enact violence on one another, across the construct of race, which, yes, it's a construct and there are systems that anchor it, but across race and also across expressions of gender and sexuality. So it's present on lots of minute layers across different communities. But yes, we have all been uprooted and then rooting into this system, or assimilating or forced to assimilate into the system where we enact violence on one another.
Where should folks who are interested in this conversation, what resources, or who, I think we'll both maybe ask the general question of who are you looking to for inspiration? And if folks are I want to learn more about this, where should folks go? And then the second order question will be, what are you offering and where can folks learn more about you?
Yeah. Really beautiful resource, Resma's book, My Grandmother's Hands, for embodiment practices, coming home to your body. I think the biggest invitation is that for us to be present in our bodies as the world is shifting around us, to sit with all that is present, that is comfort, and navigate our ways through it. So Resma's book is awesome. There's also another book called Deep Liberation by a dear beloved human named Langston Kahn, who is a shamanic practitioner who's got all these beautiful practices around rooting in your body and being present, getting some framework around what does it mean to take responsibility for your energy body, not just your physical body, but energetically, keeping your boundaries affirmed and present. And I think that's a foundational aspect of work that needs to be in line. As we're seeking connection with our ancestors, do we have the capacity to be in our bodies? Do we have the capacity to ground in those avenues of connection that are already there? Do we have the capacity to practice agency in those connections and autonomy in those connections and not be overridden by them? And so he's got some beautiful practices just in general around being in your body, rooting in your body, and taking responsibility for your energy body, who and what you're letting into your space. Another really beautiful resource is by Michelle Johnson. It's a book called Finding Refuge, Heartwork for Healing Collective Grief. So you're doing your embodiment practices and you come back to your body. Yes, it's excellent.
With you.
You come back to your body. Yes, shameless plug. You come back to your body and there's grief. Okay, here's a resource. Here's a resource for working with that grief. So Michelle's book and podcast is awesome. Another one is Love and Rage by Lana Rod Owens. Really beautiful offering. And I believe he's had some courses that you could do online with him. Super beautiful. And one that I read recently, which I'm in love with, is another unfolding of ancestral connection healing practices for me, is called The Afro Minimalist Guide to Living with Less by Christine Pratt. And she talks about what our generational relationships are to ownership of things. And so it's me locating myself within the system of capitalism, and how has that impacted my lineage, how my people have shown up, how we've come to value ourselves through things and in consumption in that way. And so that has been another really sweet resource. And I'm oh, it's another level of healing. Okay, y'all. I'm here for it. Let me just go do some practices around my grief of oh, yes, not, needing to be in better relationship with my resources and needing to understand, what these rituals of ownership are all about that I'm engaged in. So that's a really sweet offering as well.
Yeah. And then for folks who want to learn from you or engage with you, do you have any offerings, courses, or writings, or I know you have a podcast, so maybe you could plug some of the things you're up to.
Yeah, I do have a podcast that is, archived at this point and will be rebirthed under a new name. So you can go to my website, www.tamiracoussett.com, sign up for the newsletter. I do a newsletter maybe once a year, twice a year. My offerings live in the online sanctuary. that I created via the interwebs. And so things will be listed there. I have a couple of events that I'm doing. One is online, and it's a ritual container, and it's called Saltwater and Honey, a ritual prayer to spirit. I'm co-weaving that with a beloved friend and colleague, and it's going to really be a container dedicated to people sitting with their prayers for their life, for their communities, and sitting with what needs to happen for them to take action to pour into those prayers. And so it'll be a really beautiful ritual container that will hold. That's happening November 1st. That information is also on my website under the events. And I'm holding a container at a local event here in Chatham County, North Carolina, Catawba lands, at the Pepperfest through the Abundance Foundation. And in that, not the Pepperfest, the Death Fair, sorry, the Death Fair. And you can find out information on that at abundancenc.org. I'll have a container there. We'll be exploring some ancestral connections in times of change. And folks are welcome to come if you're local. And if not, if you want to make a donation to Abundance and, email me a screenshot on my form on my website, I'm happy to send some resources that I've created for folks who will gather with me, guided meditation and some reflection questions around ancestral connection practices and the container that we're in right now. So folks are welcome to follow up with that, and just stay tuned on my website. That's it.
Thank you so much, Tamira. Are there any closing words you'd like to say to close out the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to end on a note of gratitude to everyone that has gathered here, that has spent their time and life force and energy to be present with this offering. Thank you. And I hope that this conversation is inspiring people to get curious about ancestral liberation practices and coming into deeper relationship and connection with their people so that they can be supported by their people on their pathways of liberation and creating change. And I just want to thank the elevated ancestors of the folks that are listening and all the unseen layers of support that are supporting all of us for bringing the folks here that are listening to be present. And just extending gratitude for that into the earth for these bodies, because it's amazing to be alive and in a body.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tamira. We'll have to do another round because I feel like there's more to get into.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah.
There's more. There's things we didn't even touch on yet.
Yeah.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.